Hello, I'm Laurel Griffith, and welcome to Sunday School. Today we will turn our attention to the book of Ezra, and we are going to continue our discussion of worship. Today we are looking at a passage that talks about when worship is restored for the children of Israel. So just a little bit of background, because we have skipped a whole bunch of time between the time that Solomon constructed the temple and dedicated the temple to the time where we find ourselves today. And what has happened? Israel has been ruled by a series of kings, who some have been kings that followed after God, but not many of them. Most of the kings had turned away from the worship of the one true God, and as they turned away from this worship, they led the people astray. God raised up prophets who came and spoke to the people about what to expect, that He called them back to worship and to faithful living, but the people continued to disobey. God told the Israelites through the prophets that if they continued along this path, that He would send that they would be captured, that they would be taken away into exile, and that is exactly what happened. Nebuchadnezzar, the king or ruler of Babylon, came and conquered Judah, including the city of Jerusalem. This happened in three distinct waves of invasion, and the people were led away into captivity. Excuse me. The people were led away into captivity, and Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was completely burned. So the Jews lost their place of worship, even as they were taken away into a foreign land where the people worshipped at idols. So it was during this time of exile that the people recognized what they had done. They recognized their failure, and they repented. And God worked through the government and the powers of that time, and raised up King Cyrus, the Persians, who ended up defeating the Babylonians. And so Cyrus was king, and Cyrus had a lot going on geographically in terms of uprisings of various peoples, and he was determined to control the world and to have peace in the world, in the extent that a peaceful situation meant that his kingdom was more prosperous. And so Cyrus began to release the Jews to go back home, and part of the reason was he wanted them to farm, to build a society, because when they were farming and building a society, there would be a tax base for him to then collect from. And so this seems to be going on in Cyrus's mind as he allows the Jews to continue to return home. But what we know is that our God is sovereign, and the Lord was working through the time of history and the powers to be able to bring about His good purposes, which included having His people return home to Jerusalem, where they would continue to worship Him. So it is interesting to think about this return from exile. When the people come back home, they come, first of all, not all the Jews returned home. It was only the ones that felt led to go, and there were leaders that came along with them as they came in. They returned home in distinctive waves as well. Not all of them returned. Many of the Jews at the time of the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar had been scattered, so there are Jews living in other places. There were also a remnant of people that were left in Judah and Samaria, who stayed behind, and when the captives were led away into exile. So it's not as it's confusing. There's lots of different kinds of people groups. There are people that have intermarried. A lot has happened in these years since the Jews were led away into captivity. And so when the Jews return, these waves of Jews that return, they're not coming back to a clean slate. They're coming back, or maybe to a vacuum. They're coming back to a place that has been, that other people have come in and have set up society and have had power in this place. So it's not unreasonable to expect that when the Jews return that they are going to have conflict with those who have remained. So this is what we're going to see today in the lesson. So they are released to come back home. They come back home and everything is gone. It has been destroyed. Of course, they have been in captivity for 70 years. And there is a difference in terms of the time period. You can read in the text different biblical places that you'll see that sometimes it's referred to as 50 years and sometimes, or if you do the math, you'll see 50 years versus 70 years. And what you should know about that is that all of this happens in stages. So the dating of it depends upon whether you are computing the time at the very beginning of the return or the end of the return, or the very beginning of the captivity and the end of the captivity. So it's staggered captivity into Babylon and staggered release away from Babylon. So we end up with the 70 years. So at the end of these 70 years, when they return, and they come into Judah. It's the tribes of Judah and the tribes of Benjamin that are coming to resettle, to return home. There's nothing left. Everything has been destroyed. Everything has been burned. The temple does not exist. And so most of the Jews want to settle outside of Jerusalem. And so they move into villages or to begin to develop their own homes, their own places where they are going to live, and it is outside of Jerusalem. But we see in this passage today that there is a need that they recognize to begin to worship, to restore the worship of the one true God. And they do this by building an altar. And that is where we will focus our attention today, to see what happens when they make this decision. So we are looking at Ezra, and if you'll turn to chapter 3, we're going to read first verses 1 through 6, and then we're going to skip a few verses and read verses 10 through 13. When the 7th month came and the Israelites were in the towns, the people gathered together in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, with his fellow priest, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, with his kin, set out to build the altar of God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring peoples, and they offered burnt offerings upon it to the Lord morning and evening. And they kept the festival of booths as prescribed, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to ordinance as required of each day. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings of the new moon, and at all the sacred festivals of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a free will offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple was not yet laid. So what we see here is there's some leadership that's taking place. There is a priest and there is a governor, and Jeshua is the priest, and then the governor is Zerubbabel. And they set out to lead the people to construct the altar. Now, it's interesting to note that there's probably enough manpower here for them to have delegated this task out. These are the leaders of the people, but they see the value in being a part of the work that is taking place. And so it seems as though their leadership is positive, and the people are following them in order to be able to bring about the altar of the Lord. They do this in the 7th month. Now there's 2 calendars going on in Israel by this time. One is the normal calendar of time, but then there is a calendar of religious observances. And so the 7th month would translate roughly into our end of September, beginning of October, and this is when many of the feasts are celebrated. The Day of Atonement is celebrated there. These are very holy times for the people of Israel. So they are going back to the instructions that God gave Moses, and they are setting up this altar and setting up the offering of the sacrifices in accordance with the law of Moses. And this is important, something that we don't need to skim over, because what have they learned while they have been in captivity? While they have been in exile, the Israelites had plenty of time to reflect upon what got them there. What is the reason that they are sitting in Babylon, away from their homes, as they mourn and grieve their losses, and they cry out for mercy to God? It is likely, and even recorded in Scripture, that they remember, and they remember what God had told them to do and called them to do, and how they had failed to comply. So here we see that as they restore worship, they are eager to do this in accordance with the law of Moses. So that means they are paying attention to when the sacrifices are offered, they're paying attention to what kind of sacrifices are required, and they're paying attention to how how this is done, the logistics of how all of this is done. So it is a complex system of sacrificial offerings, and that is what they are doing here. There's a sentence in these verses that I find very interesting. They are in dread. Look at verse 3. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring peoples. So some translations say it this way. It is recorded in the book, in the lesson book, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundations and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both morning and evening sacrifices. So I believe this translation is the NIV translation from the book, and I'm reading out of the NRSV. But in each of these translations, what you notice is that what they are doing is they are led by God to do this. They feel compelled to do this. They have a desire to obey God and to bring about this worship. But it is not done without having this sense of fear or dread. And who are they afraid of? Well, most scholars would believe that they are afraid of the people that are around them. These neighboring peoples, and there's all kinds. There's different nationalities. There's the Jews that remained, who were left behind when the captivity began, that intermarried with Gentiles and formed Samaritans. So they're afraid of the people who were currently in the land when they returned, and it will result in conflict in future events, and we'll see more of that in the lessons to come. That there was conflict, and it was a reasonable fear. It was not unreasonable for them to expect violence or persecution from these groups of people. So they are afraid, but in spite of their fears, they continue to do the work of building the temple and establishing the sacrifices. So this is a point that I would suggest that might be good for reflection and maybe discussion in your Sunday school classes. Sometimes when we feel like God is prompting us to move forward, He's given us an assignment, there's some place that we need to respond and to obey, there is a hesitation. We have a hesitation, and that hesitation is connected to our fear. Now, we may not fear physical violence, or we may not have a physical fear, although perhaps we do at times, but there is this sense of a fear of the unknown, or a fear of the loss of control, or even the fear of rejection can be a pretty big fear. And it is interesting to know that just because we are afraid, it does not mean that we should not do the thing that God has called us to do, but rather that we should know that we have placed our trust in God, who is sovereign and who is always with us, who is our protector, our guide, the one that we trust. And as we place our trust in God, we have the courage to move forward, to do the things that He would call us to do. You know, courage is not the absence of fear, but courage is rather moving forward to do the thing that we know to be right, even in spite of the fear, even in the midst of the fear. I think we acknowledge our fear, or our concern, or our resistance to God. We ask Him for His help and that we ask Him to be with us, and then we take the next step of faith. And that is really what faith is to move forward when we don't know what to expect. To move forward following God when we're not sure exactly how something's going to end. So this is a wonderful example, and perhaps one of the most important parts of this lesson is to recognize that God calls us many times to do things that stretch us, that make us uncomfortable, and it is an invitation to join Him, to be a part of what He is doing, and it is in the stepping out in spite of the fear that our own faith will grow. So that's a wonderful point to reflect personally, but also to speak about with others in the discussion. What kinds of things are we afraid of? Have you ever had a situation where God has invited you to do something and you were hesitant to do it, and yet you persevered and you stepped out, you had courage, you demonstrated courage? And how did God come to you in those moments? And what did you learn about yourself and about this opportunity that God has placed in front of you? So use that as a point of discussion this week in the lesson. So let's continue, and we will look now at the kinds of sacrifices that the Jews are beginning to offer. There's a whole list. So let's take a look. They are offering burnt offerings upon it, and they are doing those morning and evening, and they are keeping the festival of booths, or that would be known as the festival of tabernacles. So this is one of the festivals that would have brought the people to Jerusalem. This was one of the pilgrimage festivals where everyone all over Israel would travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And perhaps you remember that this is based on the understanding that the first Israelites were led out of Egypt, and before they arrived in the promised land, they were led through the wilderness, and they lived in tents, and God provided for them, and God kept them. He was faithful to them. And so it's the idea that during this time of festival, it was really a beautiful celebration, and they were celebrating God's faithfulness, His provision for them. The Israelites would sleep outside. They would construct tents or booths for themselves, and they would sleep outside, and it was a big time of celebration where one family would engage with other families as they shared and celebrated and worshiped God. So they institute the morning and the evening sacrifices for sin, and then they institute the fellowship, or the festival of booths or tabernacles. They offer daily burnt offerings by the number according to the law, and then they offer offerings at the new moon and at all the sacred festivals of the Lord. And then they offered their freewill offerings. So one thing to note is that the new moon offerings would have been the offerings that would start at the beginning of the month, and then there are the morning and evening sacrifices. There are the festivals, Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They would have celebrated the Day of Atonement, but then they also have these free will offerings that they bring, and these are just times when they want to give an offering of gratitude to God, and these are not commanded or prescribed. So there, all of this is going on. So for it, the thing that's interesting is, if you look at all of these, what you realize is this is a really big deal. It takes a lot to be able to support this kind of sacrificial system, especially among a people who have been in exile, who are coming back home to nothing. They're coming back home to not to assume a farming that has been continuing, or raising livestock that has been going on since they've been gone. They're having to start from scratch. So here at the very beginning, they have committed themselves to not only build the altar to worship upon, but to establish all of the necessary support of the animals that is required in order to be able to carry all of this out. And it's not a small thing to have a place where all these animals are raised and cared for, to arrange to have the water, to arrange to have the delivery systems for all of this, to put in place when it has not been in place all along. So it's been a complicated process to bring about this worship, bringing the worship back for the people of Israel. But their hearts are full and they are eager to do it because it is such a vital part of their life with God and with one another. So it is a time of celebration as they begin to worship God and bring their offerings to the altar once more. They have laid the foundation, they built the altar. So another thing to know is they have built the altar even though they could not yet build the temple, because to construct the temple would require much more time, many more resources. But they have built the altar in the place where the temple had been and where the reconstruction of the temple will occur. So now they're going to build the foundation of the temple, and we'll see that in verses 10 through 13. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments were stationed to praise the Lord with trumpets, and the Levites and the son of Asaph with cymbals according to the directions of King David of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people responded with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and the Levites and heads of families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud with joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout and the sound of the people weeping, for the people shouted so loudly that the sound was heard far away. So the foundation of the temple is built, and so it's the first step towards building the temple. And the people have gathered and they are praising God. The priests that have returned from exile are wearing the vestments. It's the beginning of what all is to come, and it's a reminder of all that they have experienced in the past. And the priests are leading the people to worship God with song, with instruments, and they are bringing back the